virtual networking and the virtual switches is in many ways segregated in the processes one would go through for connecting the virtual machines to those switches. And so if you're thinking about how you will break apart what the different job roles are and what the actions associated with each job role will be for the different people in your environment, the type of person who will deal with the virtual switches may be at a level with more experience, I'll say, than someone who's actually creating new virtual machines. In fact, you can create these virtual switches and isolate them off with permissions so that people that maybe aren't even in IT or that are a junior level IT people can come and create virtual machines and just assign them to the correct virtual switches as you see fit. I can, if I want, add multiple network cards here. Generally, you're not going to do this unless you have the need to separate out networking across multiple different pathways. If I choose next, I can choose a SCSI controller. It's going to give me the SCSI control that it believes performs best for this OS. And then I can choose the virtual disk I want. Now I'm going to create a new virtual disk here because I want to create that virtual disk associated with the virtual machine. If I wanted to create, after creating this virtual machine, if I wanted to create a different type of disk that wasn't encapsulated into a VMDK file, I could create a raw device mapping. Now you'll see here it says that this gives your virtual machine direct access to a SAN, and more specifically what this says is the information that's contained within a raw device mapping is not bundled together or encapsulated into that VMDK file. There are certain types of workloads that this works fairly well with. For example, situations where I don't want to have to consolidate all of those files that make up a Windows box and its workload into a VMDK file. For now, we're interested in just working with VMDKs, so I'm going to create a new virtual disk, and I'm going to create it as a thin provisioned virtual disk of type 40 gigabytes or size 40 gigabytes. This is important because the thin provision disks, as we've talked about before, allow me to create that virtual disk but not actually consume the storage space until the virtual machine actually needs to. Now this is different between lazy zeroed and eager zeroed in the thick provisioning model. In the thick provisioning model, I'm actually going to go about extending a full VMDK file of the size that I've set the capacity to. So in this case, if I chose thick provision lazy zeroed, well, I need to have available 40 gigs of space on that LUN that's pulled in for this data store. Now the difference here between lazy zeroed and eager zeroed relates to whether or not you want ESX, Vsphere, to go about specifically zeroing out the contents of that VMDK file as it gets created. Now in a lazy zeroed model, the space is provisioned, but the space probably contains some contents that were on there before. Now, the operating system doesn't care about these contents. It knows it's not there. But there are certain security guidelines that require you to eager zero out some of these thick provision virtual machines. You do this, again, only when you want ESX to go through and run a zero or drop a zero into every location that's necessary across the entire 40 gigabit size of that VMDK file. I want to make things easy, though. In making things easy, I want to use as little storage as possible. So I'm going to choose thin provision here, and I'm going to choose the location, essentially, to store with the virtual machine, meaning I want to store the virtual disk, the VMDK file, with the VMX file that's associated with that virtual machine. If I wanted to choose it, I could put it somewhere else if I wanted to. However, generally, this is not a good idea unless you have a specific reason to do so. It's generally a good idea to keep the disk file with the virtual machine configuration file. It just makes things easier, puts them all in a nice folder for you. So let's click 40 gigs, thin provision, store with the virtual machine for now. And I want to choose just the same SCSI virtual device node here. I'm not going to choose any independent mode associated with this disks. For most of the virtual machines you create, you're not going to create any, or you're not going to select independent mode for the disks, because those independent disks are not going to be impacted by snapshots, which can impact your ability to do snapshots, and it also impacts some of the backup programs that you might have. In a persistent mode, those changes are immediately and permanently written to the disk, whereas in a non-persistent mode, the changes to the disks are going to be discarded when you power off or revert to the snapshot. So these create some very special types of disk situations that you have to be conscious about before you actually select them. Again, you probably won't be using these modes very often. Choose Next and choose Finish to complete the build of the virtual machine. And you'll see there I am. VM1 has now been created. If I take a look at the Summary tab, it looks relatively similar to VM6. My console is going to show black here because I haven't actually powered on this virtual machine. And I'm not going to power it on because you've seen what that looks like at this point. So I've got my nice guest OS here, my VM version, the CPU and memory, and all the stuff that we looked at before. In the next nugget, we're actually going to spend some time going down here into the Edit Settings location.